This video is brought to you by Dungeons of Drakenheim. 15 years ago, Drakenheim was destroyed by an eldritch storm of falling stars. Now, the city is a dismal urban wasteland contaminated by otherworldly magic and haunted by hideous monsters. Fantastic wealth, lost knowledge, and powerful artifacts lie ready for the taking by adventurers brave or foolish enough to venture into the ruins. Explore over 20 ruined urban locations including haunted streets, decrepit sewers, shattered mage towers, baroque cathedrals, and ancient castles inhabited by dozens of nightmarish new monsters inspired by dark fantasy and cosmic horror. Each site features evocative descriptions, gorgeous illustrations, and detailed maps. Personal quests, tantalizing rumors, and lightweight urban exploration mechanics allow player characters to experience the ruins in a non-linear and open-ended fashion. Dungeons of Drakenheim is a 5th edition campaign for characters level 1 to 13, currently on Kickstarter, so go over to the link below and support them. But now, on to the video. So I have been playing a lot of Ghosts of Saltmarsh recently. That's the adventure that I've been running with my private group every single week. And this adventure is particularly unique. It's very interesting because it's not a normal traditional adventure as the others that you would find in 5th edition. Instead, it is a collection of a bunch of different mini adventures that have nautical themes. Old adventures from like old times. And they were brought in, put into this book, and just kind of like they were sort of designed in such a way so that you could kind of have a traditional adventure just going through these different mini adventures. However, there's a lot of, I guess, empty spaces within the book that you would have to fill for yourself. For example, you can't really go from level 1 to level 12 just straight up using the book. You kind of have to fill in adventures here and there made by yourself, presumably, for you to fit in some of the holes. Like, I don't think there's an adventure that takes you from 6 to 7 or one that takes you from 9 to 10, for example. Like, there's a lot of holes like that you kind of have to fill yourself, which is fine, you know. For those of you that enjoy homebrewing, a book like Ghosts of Saltmarsh is fantastic. Now, I've never been known as a person that particularly enjoys homebrewing, but hey, I took it as a little bit of a challenge. I wanted to give it a shot. I've been doing a lot of homebrewing recently. Of course, some of you who were paying attention, I actually did a couple of monsters for the Grim Hollows monster manual that they're still developing. So, you know, I was just kind of getting my toes wet a little bit with the whole homebrewing thing, just learning a little bit of the ropes and using, I guess, this as a form of experiment. So this is something that I personally like to do a lot during my adventures. I like to make every single campaign that I run as a dungeon master a little bit unique in that I like to test something entirely new. So when I played To Annihilation a long time ago, I decided, this is going to be the experience campaign. I was going to try experience because I've always done the milestone system. When I did Curse of Strahd, I tried the greedy realism system that they have in the Dungeon Master's Guide, which is basically a long rest takes 7 days to complete, and a short rest is a single full day. And, you know, that was a blast to experience it. So I like to kind of just do that to just, you know, keep things a little bit interesting. And for Ghosts of Saltmarsh, of course, other than the just incredible amounts of homebrew that I would have to do in order to make this campaign work, I decided to take it a step further. Instead, normally you would take, well, the last adventure that you can find on the book generally would take you to level 12. I decided instead to just have it basically take me to level 20 and make an entire adventure that is just sort of roughly set with what happens during that last adventure, which of course I don't want to necessarily spoil, but effectively I made an entire campaign out of Ghosts of Saltmarsh that takes you from level 1 to level 20. And so the experiment that I wanted to do is I wanted to allow my players every single avenue of power that I could think of. I wanted to give them plenty amounts of gold for them to do whatever they wanted to do. If they wanted to hire 200 mercenaries to take care of their goals and missions, like, hey, I would allow that. I wanted to give them, every time they would go back to town, I would have a magic shop just ready for them to just buy as many magical items as they could afford. Of course, rolling on tables, I wouldn't necessarily pick the magic items. I would just let the die do all the talking. I also had this system that I particularly really enjoy, which kind of ties up to a discussion that we had in one of my previous videos where I talked about the requirements of gold and how important it is to have gold sort of matter in your Dungeons and Dragons adventure. And so what I wanted to try, this is just like a side note, I wanted to figure out how if it would be fun to have gold almost function as experience in a way. So the more gold that you collect, if you hit like a very specific threshold, then it would improve your character in some way. And so I designed a system where, like, for every single individual character in the adventure, if you collected 5,000 gold pieces, then you would effectively get a free attribute increase, as if you had reached level 4 or level 8, right? So you get to increase either your stats or you can pick a feat. Then I would double the requirement, so the next time it would require 10,000, and if you reached that number, then you would get a completely free level up. Then I would double it again. If you got 20,000 gold pieces, I would allow you to pick a feature from your class, but from a different subclass. And so I had this entire new system in there, and then I had them get just a bunch of money, and I had them get a bunch of magical items, and I wanted to see what would happen if I had these extraordinarily powerful, and my players are quite competent in the game too, so that was also kind of important. So what would happen if I would have these level, I don't know, 15, 17 characters, and have them just be decked out with some of the most powerful items in the game, with as many attribute increases or feats as they would want, and then just pit them against some of the strongest monsters that I could come up with here in Dungeons & Dragons. And of course, doing a little bit of my own homebrew, creating my own monsters, and see just what I could learn from this experience. Because I've been really interested in just the notion of monster creation, but particularly in balance. I've been very, very interested in the concept of challenge rating and what it really takes in order to create, in quotes, a balanced game. Now, of course, some of my players went for some of the more degenerate routes that one would imagine. For example, one of my players is an artificer that has just as base AC 23. So he's just always walking around with at least 23 AC, and of course, every single encounter, he always casts haste on themselves. So he basically just runs around in combat with 25 AC, and he gets access to the spell Shield, which would of course take them all the way up to 30 AC, which effectively just makes him impossible to be hit. I mean, just to put it into perspective, an adult red dragon, which is considered to be basically like a last boss for all intents and purposes, has a plus 14 to hit, right? So this guy would have to effectively get a 15 to be able to, at least like a 14 or a 15 on the roll with a plus 14 to hit to be able to actually hit this guy. I mean, this is the level of degeneracy that I'm kind of dealing with at this point. And of course, I have and this is a very, very popular, I guess, build for those of you who, make characters specifically for the purposes of, say, maybe defeating a Tarask or something like that. Or those of you who, because this is something that I've done in the past, doing battle royales, just kind of like Dungeons & Dragons PvP. It's a very popular build, is to make a fighter archer with the sniper feat. So what makes that so particularly powerful is of course sniper feat. You have to take a -5 to your hit on your attack, but then if you do hit, you deal a plus 10 to that damage. So it's just basically deal high amounts of damage with this feat. It's a feat that I think most people kind of just recognize as being a little bit too strong, and by a little bit I mean way too strong. But the thing about the archer and the fighter is that, of course, the fighter gets 3 attacks at level 11, which is really strong, and then the archer, which is your martial kind of style that you pick at level 1 for the fighter, it gives you a plus 2 to your attack when you're using ranged weapons, which is, by the way, outrageous. I mean, that is equivalent of getting a plus 4 to your dexterity for the purposes of hitting. So it's really good. And then, of course, I mean, by this point in time, when you're level 11, when you're level 14, you're more than likely to have at least a +2 weapon. I mean, this is just going to be completely common. And of course, at these levels as well, your proficiency modifier is going to be at least a +4, a +5, or sometimes even a +6 if you're like really high up on those levels. So the gist of it is that you're just not going to miss. You're just not going to miss, especially because of the bounded accuracy system that Dungeons & Dragons designed. Most monsters don't actually have an armor class higher than 19. That's just not the way that they design the game. There are obviously monsters that do, but generally speaking, they don't. So, you know, I could summon CR 15, 17 enormous monsters. You know, I could give them Balrogs. I could give them Marilids, and these monsters are just going to have an AC of 18 or 19. So basically what I'm saying is that fighter or ranger guy is just not going to miss. He's going to basically hit every single one of his 3 attacks, and I mean, in this case, my particular player is playing as a battle master, so he gets the snipe maneuver, which they added recently, which allows him to, as a bonus action, get an extra attack. So this guy is hitting 4 times, dealing +10 damage on every single one of those, and basically just not missing for a free extra 40 damage that normally this archetype should not be able to do. And so that's just the level of degeneracy that I'm dealing with. And of course, all players have their own strengths, right, and weaknesses. But I thought it would be really interesting to see just how far I could push my characters, my players, and then how I would adapt and what sort of things I would do in order to combat that. Now, having a lot of AC, which is something that basically, you know, most of my players have at this point, it's just very easy to get really high AC when you're high level, because I mean, even as a caster, right? Like at this point, you have maximized your stats to a point where if you're using something like mage armor, you probably have really high dexterity. If you're like a barbarian, you probably have high dexterity and constitution, right? Something like that. But also, it is so easy to get a +2 shield at this point, considering that a +2 shield is only rare. Like it's not even very rare, so you could probably get some for 2,500 gold pieces, 5,000 gold pieces, just following the rules of Senathar's Guide to Monsters. So it really doesn't take too much, really, for you to be able to achieve these high levels of AC. But it's actually very easy to solve those problems, and I found it actually quite trivial as a dungeon master to just kind of circumvent, let's just say, my extraordinarily high ACs on my players, just using saving throws, of course, for spells, sort of shifting the way that some abilities function so that they would maybe target dexterity saving throws, things of that nature. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that you can always do. There's abilities that automatically do damage, things like that. Like, it's not a big deal. But what I found it very difficult to fix, and this is where I've been hitting a lot of more issues, I should say, was the fighter. Back when I was starting my DMing, you know, sort of beginnings, I should say, when I didn't really know what I was doing, what was going on, what was strong, what wasn't. I just kind of let my players, you know, just have as much fun as possible. I remember back in those days, I would say like, oh yeah, I don't really want Unearthed Arcana. You know, I just kind of want to just do the player's handbook just so that I know what I'm doing, so that I have a good grasp as to like what you guys are capable of and all these different, you know, so I was that DM back in those days. And I was playing actually an adventure from Tales of the Yawning Portal. It's an adventure that takes you into this enormous dungeon. I don't necessarily want to spoil the adventure, but effectively what happens is it's an adventure that has you be level 12 or so, and you, at the very end of it, end up fighting a Demilich. So a Demilich is supposed to be basically a last boss. It's an extraordinarily powerful lich that has let their body decay in such a way that they just are now a skull, a floating skull. Now, the Demiliches are a CR 18 monster. They are very, very dangerous, and if you're not ready to fight these guys, there's literally nothing that you'll be able to do to them. Like, they're just extraordinarily resistant to all kinds of damage. Very difficult to hit them with magic, of course, and you know, they will stun you, they will fear you, they are just going to heal back all the damage that you've done to it with its special abilities. Like, these guys are something to fear. However, and again, this is me, of course, being very untrained in the arts of DMing, when I had my players fight it, and this was supposed to be this, you know, climactic ending to this massive adventure that they've been in, they ended up defeating the Demilich in a single round. Now, of course, when you, if you're a little bit more expert in the arts of D&D, you would know, of course, that the Demilich has a pittance, let's say, of HP when compared to other monsters of its caliber. Again, we'll keep using the adult red dragon here as an example. The adult red dragon has somewhere upwards of 250 something HP, right? And that's maybe something that you should be expecting for something of this particular level. And the Demilich, which is, by the way, just 1 CR higher, is supposed to be stronger than the adult red dragon. A Demilich only has 80 or so hit points. Now you might say, well, that doesn't make any sense. How is that possible? I am sure that maybe the Demilich has other things that maybe compensates, and it does. That is true. However, it doesn't always matter. One of my players, had one of those fighters who at that point in time had 3 attacks and could basically do snipe. So he would get an extra 10 damage in every single one of his strikes. And of course, he has Action Surge, which effectively just grants him an entire other turn. And then him with the other party members just happen to very easily just destroy 80 hit points, which is, again, nothing compared to what monsters of this particular level should have. And this is, and I'm sure this happens to almost every DM. I mean, this is almost like a rite of passage in Dungeons & Dragons, where every single person that either creates monsters or is DMing an adventure or is putting their own monsters in on, say, dungeons that they have themselves created, you always find yourself in a situation where your players are just going to destroy this monster that you thought should have lasted longer. And typically, these conversations will kind of just evolve into basically talks of what is even the point of challenge rating, because I've seen this conversation a lot online. A lot of people have this very interesting, I should say, criticism of Dungeons & Dragons is, what is even the point of challenge rating? You can have a dragon be a certain challenge rating, and which is supposed to be just a medium sized, encounter for my party, but then that dragon will just breathe out fire and basically just one-shot my entire party. What is the point of that? Right? People have a lot of issues with that, and it makes sense. And I was having those conversations too back in those days, figuring out what I had done wrong. I mean, for all intents and purposes, that Demilich should have been a deadly encounter for my players. It should have been very, very difficult and an epic boss, and that's what I was expecting. Of course, everyone talks about liches, and it wasn't. Now, the Demilich is a particularly interesting case because it does have as its main action, like it literally is its only, it has many attacks, but its main action is the ability for it to deal necrotic damage to everyone around him within 10 feet of him. And then he literally heals for the amount of damage that he deals. So on average, he deals 20 points of necrotic damage to a person, and if he hits 2 or 3 people, he will deal around 60 points of damage and then heal by 60 points of damage. So that's how the Demilich sort of stays alive. And then it uses his legendary actions to basically just move around the place, cast spells, keep people afraid, keep people prone with his layer actions as well. This is a lot of stuff that the creature can do to just kind of stay alive. And then on top of that, it has this very unique feature that actually not many other monsters have, which is it has resistance to magic weapons, which again, not many other monsters have. It's completely immune to mundane weapons, but then resistant to magic weapons. So effectively, if you're attacking the creature with physical attacks, regardless of whether they're magical or not, he effectively has twice the amount of HP that it shows, because he is resistant. He's taking half damage, right? He also has magic resistance, which means that his saving throws are with advantage when dealing with magic. And on top of that, he has avoidance, which again, very rare to have. But it basically means that if he succeeds on a saving throw on a spell that would deal half damage on a success, he just takes no damage. So this guy is very tricky. He's a very shifty character that, even though it looks like he's very weak, and he basically, has only 80 HP, he's meant to last for a long time. Yet it didn't. Any person, of course, who sees the stat block of the Demilich can tell that all you really need is a spell attack and you basically get to completely just go through every single defense that this guy has. If you can cast something like a Scorching Ray, for example, or a spell that kind of works in that similar way, where you instead of doing a saving throw effect, you just do a spell attack that deals a ton of whatever damage that this guy is not particularly resistant to, you can just blow this guy to smithereens. I mean, realistically, all you need is just 2 people that are able to do 40 points of damage. If you can just have 2 wizards cast 5th level arcane magic missiles, rather, I mean, this guy's dead. And so this was the moment when I started thinking, how does this balance actually work? How do you figure out that the Demilich is a CR 18 monster? Who decides that, I guess? Like, what's the math? Because Dungeons & Dragons is a very math-oriented game. I mean, there's all kinds of numbers that happen in the background. They basically have it to a T designed how much damage a level 3 character is supposed to do, how much damage HP, armor class, proficiency rating, like what are the numbers that a CR 3 or 4 or 5 monster is supposed to have. These are numbers that we actually have. These are stats that are shown to us and given to us in the Dungeon Master's Guide. So if you go into page 274, and this is like for any DM out there who is deciding to make their own monsters or wants to just, if you're having issues, I suppose, with CR in your adventures, if you feel like your monsters are dying too quick, then I please, you need to check this out, because this is one of the most crucial and important things that I have ever come across in my entire time sort of DMing to figure out how to make battles more enjoyable. In page 274 of the Dungeon Master's Guide, there is this table called Creating Quick Monster Stats. It basically tells you, I mean, everything that we have talked about. For a CR 13 monster, for example, it tells you that that monster should have, on average, about 18 armor class, 260 something HP. It tells you how much damage the creature should be doing, and if it has spells, what the save DC for those spells should be. This is crucial. And what's interesting about these numbers is that you will find that these numbers, and specifically the HP, which is the main topic of this conversation, you'll find that the HP is way higher than what the monsters actually has. So if you were to look at almost any monster, and we can use our beautiful example of the Adult Red Dragon, which is going to be a great example for this entire video. The Adult Red Dragon has 250 something HP, and that is a CR 17 monster. But if you check the table here for what HP a CR 17 monster is supposed to have, you will see that they're supposed to have around 311 to 325. Yet that doesn't seem to really match up too well, does it? Now, these differences become extreme in some examples. I mean, let's talk about the CR 1/4 monsters. You can grab a black bear, for example. The black bears have 19 HP to their name, whereas according to this table, they're supposed to have 36 to 49. This goes all across the board. I mean, I really do implore you to go just look into the monster manual, look at the monsters that you're using, look at the monsters that you are putting into your dungeons. Every single time that you feel like your monsters are dying too quick, just grab that monster and then compare it to this table and see how much that monster should actually have in HP. And then you will see a very interesting thing. Monsters die way too quick, way quicker than they should, and this is a good reason. Now, the way that they have designed this is very interesting, but it does have a lot of flaws. See, every single thing that you add onto a monster stat sheet that presumably would give it some kind of benefit, say for example defensively, it actually is supposed to increase the HP of the monster. At least the effective HP of the monster, we should say. So for example, if you give your dragon resistance to bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage made by non-magical weapons, if your players do not have magical weapons, then that would be as if you were doubling the HP of the monster effectively. Because that's literally what you're doing, because you're doing half damage. That's basically the idea behind all of this. Now, of course, the counterpoint to that is that every character has magic weapons, at least generally speaking, starting from level 5. Not everyone does, of course, and as a DM, that's something that you can keep control of course, but generally speaking, that is the case. I mean, monks basically get magic fist after level 6, same as moon druids, paladins, wizards, warlocks. Some of these characters either get magical weapons through their eldritch invocations, or they just get access to magic weapon, which is a 2nd level spell. Or, of course, any type of magic weapon that you can find in the adventure. So generally speaking, at least it seems to me like it is the case with my experience that player characters after level 5 generally have access to magic weapons. Yet, that is something, interestingly enough, that the balance, the math crunching that happens in the background for all of these challenge ratings in the creatures do not take into consideration. I want you to look at this table here real quick. It says it's called effective hit points based on resistances and immunities. And this alone here, I mean, and of course some other smaller things here and there, this is what's creating this problem where your bosses are dying too quick. And this is something that you need to take into consideration. So for example, let's say that we have a bandit that has 100 hit points. And, based on the amount of damage that bandit does, based on the armor class that he has, we would figure out a particular challenge rating for this creature. But if you then were to decide to give this guy resistance to, let's say, acid, psychic, and force damage, what you're actually doing in terms of the math, like if Dungeons & Dragons, if Wizards of the Coast was creating this creature and putting it on a monster manual, you would find that they would calculate that their effective HP is not actually 100. Instead, it would be 150, because according to this table over here, you should multiply the actual HP of the creature by 1.5 to create the effective HP that the monster actually has. And then using that effective HP, that's the HP that you use in order to calculate the challenge rating of the monster. So now you can imagine what happens when you have a monster that does have a resistance to acid, psychic, and force, but then also a resistance to piercing, slashing, and bludgeoning for non-magical weapons. What happens is you have two factors that each give 1.5 times multiplier on the effective HP of the monster. So this bandit that normally would have 100 HP, now basically based on the stats on the actual math happening on the background, the math says that effectively this guy has 200 HP. And so it is going to be rated in the challenge rating system as if it had 200 HP. So when you look at all the monsters that, and we can go back to this table over here, a monster that is supposed to have 200 HP or so generally should be a CR 9 to a CR 10 monster. But if you were to put the bandit there, you would, of course, be severely under HP'd compared to its peers. Oh, I had to re-edit this thing in because I forgot to mention, but what I was saying is imagining that you have a monster that has resistance to acid, force, and psychic, but then also resistance to bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing weapons made with non-magical weapons, the effective HP of that monster should be about double. Even though, if you have a character or a group of party members who already have magic weapons and just don't happen to use acid, force, or psychic as their spell damage, which again is most players because nobody uses those, then you're effectively gimping your monster dramatically without actually having it matter or have any reason for that to be the case. Just wanted to put that out there. Just remember that was a point I wanted to touch, but I didn't say it at the time, so here it is. This happens all the time, all across the board. You would be surprised at the kind of stuff that monsters have in their stats that actually increases or reduces their challenge rating into something that maybe they shouldn't be. Like things like magic resistance, for example, whether the creature has the ability to fly, the ability to climb, or the ability to burrow. Using back our example of the red adult dragon is the Frightful Presence. Frightful Presence is interesting because, of course, anyone who has fought against or used a dragon before knows how powerful it can be if you manage to get an entire group of enemies frightened. It basically, well, effectively means that every single one of their attacks is going to be a disadvantage against you, and if they're a melee class, they cannot get close to you to attack you, so they're basically boned for as long as they're afraid. So it is really, really powerful. However, you very easily can also find yourself in a situation in which it just doesn't affect you, whether you completely pass the saving throw, or maybe you are with a paladin, which either makes you completely immune to the frightened condition or gives you enormous bonuses to the saving throws because of their auras, or really any other kind of thing. I mean, you can become immune to the frightened condition for literally like a myriad of reasons. However, just the monster having that on its stat block, according to the math of the whole system of how this is designed, just having that on the stat block increases the effective HP of the monster by 25%. So again, looking back at our bandit, if we were to give him Frightful Presence, that would be as if the monster, instead of having 100 HP, had 125, right? And then of course you compound that with any other thing that you add to the monster, like all the resistances, and you're gonna have a monster that is gonna be severely understated for its level. Ladies and gentlemen, this is what's happening to a lot of your monsters. So if you ever wondered why on God's green earth is the Mummy Lord, which is, by the way, like another really good example, why does the Mummy Lord have only 97 HP when it is a CR 15 monster? Like, that absolutely makes no sense. Why are my bosses dying so quickly? This is why. If you ever, this is again like the greatest thing that I can give you for those of you who are looking into homebrewing, creating your own monsters, populating your own dungeons, or just generally fucking creating a really cool boss. Use this table. I have been doing it, and this is why I brought back why I started this whole video talking about my Ghost of Saltmarsh experience. I've basically been creating CR 17, 18 monsters just to contend with the power of my magnificent players, and I found this table to be incredible. I've also used it for a couple of smaller things here and there, but this is the greatest gift that I can give you, and I'm doing this video because I know that a lot of you actually don't see this. This is hidden. I mean, this is basically like at the end of the Dungeon Master's Guide, and nobody reads this book, so I am just giving this to you so that you can get access to this. This is crucial. Now, I would not necessarily basically counsel you to use this for monsters that are fighting players that are between level 1 to level 4. Everyone knows already that combat early game is very deadly. I think things are generally pretty good over there. I mean, you can, of course, use it at your own prerogative, but that's just my counsel. Generally speaking, after level 5, go bananas. I mean, this is great. Now, this entire conversation has kind of just revolved around HP and defensive stats, but then there's the entire other side of the coin, which is offensive stats. Now, I don't want to go too deep into this, more so than I already have. I feel like you guys kind of get the point, but I do want to go back once again to our lovely adult red dragon example, because the dragons, typically when people talk about the issues with CR, generally speaking, the dragons tend to be sort of like the main focus points in here, and that's because whenever, everyone has been on the, I have personally TPK'd players using dragons. I mean, it happens to everybody, where you feel like this should be a very balanced encounter, and then the dragon breathes, literally, like, breath weapon breathes, and your entire party dies, right? And so, using the adult red dragon example, you will see here, based on the table, that a dragon of this power should be doing around 105 to 110 damage per round. Now, when you actually grab the bite of the dragon and the claws and the tail attacks, you cannot forget, this is the thing with legendary creatures, is that they have legendary actions. When you combine all of these attacks, including the tail attacks from the legendary actions, you will actually come up to that number. Like, it's actually on the spot. Dragons do the damage that they are supposed to do. But then you grab the breath weapon and you will realize that things kind of get a little bit out of control. Now, according to the math of Dungeons and Dragons, the CR is calculated with the underlying assumption that your breath weapon is going to hit only 2 people, but that those 2 people failed their saving throws. So in the case of the red dragon, that would effectively mean about 132 points. I hope that I did my math correctly. There are 130, I think it's 126 actually, average damage, fire damage that you're doing with your breath weapon when you hit 2 people and they fail their saving throw. So that is, of course, already higher than the average damage that a monster of this caliber should be doing. But then on top of that, you have to consider that you still have to do your legendary actions, which includes 3 tail swipes, which each deal 17 points of damage. So at the end of the day, you're almost doing twice what you're actually supposed to do with a dragon. And that's where things can get a little bit crazy, of course. And so what happens to a lot of people is, you end up targeting 4 characters. instead of 2. And then 3 or 4 out of those 4 characters failed their saving throw. And then on top of that, you have your legendary action to tail swipe. So what ends up happening is now suddenly you're doing 3 to 4 times the amount of damage that a monster of this caliber should be doing further around. And then that monster, that dragon, just gets their breath weapon back because you were lucky and rolled a 5 or a 6 on your recharge. So you just get to do it all over again. And so mathematically speaking, you have this issue where you're effectively not using a CR-17 dragon, but a CR-24 or 27 creature instead, based on just the raw damage that you're bringing into the table. Now, that's, of course, a problem as well. So the way that the Dread Dragon is balanced overall is it has way more offensive stuff than defensive stuff, if that makes any sense. Because the way that CR is supposed to be calculated, when you're actually, you have all the stats ready, you know what he's good at, you know what he's weak at, and how do you actually put a number to it. What you do is you grab the HP and the armor class of the creature, and then you create a CR based on that, and you call this your defensive CR. Then you add the offensive numbers. That would be, all of your spell abilities. If you use a lot of spells, that would be your save DC. Then how much damage you deal per round, generally speaking. And then, of course, your attack bonus, which for a dragon is tremendously high for a monster of its level. It's actually a plus 14, which is way higher than it should be. And so what you do is, and then you make a CR with that. So that would be your offensive CR. So then you grab your defensive CR and your offensive CR and you make an average out of it, and that would be your actual monster CR. So of course, based on this math, just based on the amount of HP that the dragon actually has, which is again 250 something, the dragon should be a CR-12 monster, defensively speaking. But offensively speaking, I mean, this guy deals so much damage that it is effectively a CR-20 monster or 22 monster. So when you average those two numbers, that's how you end up with a CR-17 monster, and that's kind of where we are now. And that's just an example of how the math actually kind of functions in the background, just to give you an idea of how it works. So, and now that you know how it works, now that you have this table, I implore you to use it. I implore you to use the HP more than anything. I mean, you can do whatever you wish with attacks, attack bonuses, proficiency bonuses. That doesn't matter quite as much. Of course, AC, you're the DM, you figure that out, but HP. This is the key, boys. Get it. So just to finalize the conversation here, going back to the whole CR talk of whether it is useful or worthless or whether it makes sense or not, the idea here is that there is a math behind all of these numbers. So it makes sense. The math is there. We've talked about it. We've calculated it. We can see where things can go wrong when you basically have to average offensive CR and defensive CR, because you have a dragon that is effectively a CR-22 dragon or monster offensively, but then just a CR-13 or so monster defensively. It doesn't quite make a lot of sense. So the system does have a lot of factors that can be problematic, especially for someone who doesn't understand the underlying inner workings of it. But it makes sense. It's there. There's math to it. We can understand it. The problem that happens is when you have these monsters that have way higher effective HP than their actual HP, because you're calculating in all the resistances and the abilities like magic resistance or flying or all these other things that the creature has in order to calculate a CR with the effective HP rather than the actual HP. But then you have players that can completely bypass those resistances. Like, for example, you may have a fighter ranger that can just shoot the dragon in the sky as if he didn't have fly. Or you can have, for example, a wizard that just casts a fire spell instead of a cold spell against a creature that is resistant to cold. So effectively what is happening here is all of the creatures that you're using on your adventures should have a lot more HP than what they are actually showing. So if you're having this issue, just use this table for the HP values, and I promise you that you're gonna have a way better time. Anyways, guys, that's my rambling. This is something that has been on my mind lately. I've been using this table a lot lately, and it just made my games so much better when monsters can actually last for more than just 2 rounds. It makes combat, you know what it is? It feels like this is what it should be. Because monsters dying too quick doesn't feel quite as fun, at least not for the Dungeon Master. And for the players, it feels like... I just had a Dracolich encounter where I didn't use this. And the encounter was so quick that my players were confused as to what had happened, because they defeated the dragon in like, it was like 2 or 3 rounds. And a Dracolich is supposed to be an enormous encounter, and it wasn't. And they were confused. They thought that I had tricked them, or that there was something else going on, or that maybe it was just supposed to be like a comedic battle or something, because it just didn't have the same punch as a Dracolich should have. And, you know, that's what happens. And I'm sure that if it happens to me, it happens to you guys. But anyways, thank you guys so much for watching. Thank you for just listening to me rambling. I know that I repeated myself. I went around in circles a few times in there. But hey, that's what happens when I just talk unscripted. This is why I typically script my stuff, because I'm not very good at just talking off the cuffs. But anyways, thank you guys for being here, and I'll see you all next time.